Professor Zacharie, I was in the side that
Well, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming this morning. We really appreciate it. Welcome to the President James K. Polk State Historic Site. My name is Scott Warren. I'm the site manager here. This is the birthplace of our nation's 11th president. So again, welcome. I am very pleased to welcome today Zach Kinslow. Zach here is going to do just a fascinating discussion on Elias Polk, one of the 5 enslaved people we know that were born here at the Polk farm before the Polks left to move out to Tennessee. A little bit about Zach. He's a native of Maury County, Tennessee. He holds a master's degree from Austin Peay State University. For 5 years, he worked for the President James K. Polk home in Columbia, Tennessee, as both a docent and a museum educator. Zach has previously worked as an intern on the papers of President Martin Van Buren at Cumberland University and as an adjunct professor of history at Austin Peay State University and Columbia State Community College. He has had numerous works published in academic journals, including the Tennessee Historical Quarterly, the White House Journal of History, a chapter within James K. Polk and His Time, published by UT Press, and an upcoming work, Images of America, James K. Polk Home and Museum, expected to be published by Arcadia Press in April of
next month.
Next month, okay.
Does it say 24 on there?
Yeah, it does.
Oh, well. It'd be out by now.
Yeah. Since 2020, Zach has served as executive director of the Clement Railroad Hotel Museum at the Hotel Holbrook State Historic Site in Dickson, Tennessee. It is my pleasure to welcome Zach Kinslow.
How's everybody doing?
Great.
Good. I am very excited to be here at the President James K. Polk State Historic Site. Originally, I am from Maury County, Tennessee, which is the other Polk site. And for a while there was always talking about, the state owns it, why not call it the James K. Polk State Historic Site out there? And I think confusion in Googling is why that ended up not happening. But yeah, so I am currently, and I'll do the plug for my place, that is where I currently work, the Clement Railroad Hotel Museum at the Hotel Holbrook State Historic Site in Dickson, Tennessee, former railroad hotel where Tennessee's 41st governor, Frank G. Clement, was born in 1920. So that's what I do today. But for pretty much over the last decade, I have also worked in Polk. My first real job I ever got in history came in 2015. I was hired on just as a tour guide at the President James K. Polk Home and Museum in Columbia, and kind of fell in love with doing museum work in that era and that time period. So it's a bit odd for me to switch and then go to 20th century Tennessee history in my current job, but I never quite left doing the Polks. My master's thesis was Elias Polk. My capstone paper was Elias Polk. And I kind of went through all of that. Now, has anyone here, besides the people that worked here, heard of Elias Polk before? Don't worry if you haven't. Okay, we've got a couple. Again, don't worry if you haven't. Most people have not. I was told a second ago I'm referenced on the Wikipedia page for him, which is great. I mean, the only one that's ever written about him, so that's even cooler. But as long as people have been writing about James K. Polk, people have been writing about Elias Polk. But he comes across in a passing reference, in a sentence, at times in a way that's not maybe accurate or correct. And so when I ever do these talks, I like to start off with a quote here. And it's a quote from the book Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. In 1952, the novel opens with Ellison, his unnamed narrator, proclaiming, "I am an invisible man. I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids. I might even be said to possess a mind. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings themselves or figments of their imagination, indeed everything and anything except me." And that's kind of how historians and the scholars and writers have kind of taken Elias Polk's story. He's there, he's mentioned, but they make him what they want him to be instead of maybe who he actually was. First time I ever came in contact with Elias Polk, it was an exhibit, the President James K. Polk home in Columbia had done on James K. Polk's retirement home, Polk Place in Nashville, which was demolished in 1901. And I wasn't involved in putting it up, but I was involved in taking it down, and there was a kind of a plat map of the property, and there were slave quarters on it. And I just got to asking questions about the enslaved that lived there. And the curator there, Tom Price at the time, mentioned, he goes, we don't really know a lot about the enslaved people. There's not been a lot really researched and written on it. I said, but he said, there was this one guy named Elias, and we think he may have had like a political career after emancipation. And I thought, okay, well, I'll look into that. And the more I looked into it, the more I found. And then the more I found, the more I looked into it, and the more I realized I'm going to have to research other things to kind of get these together. So as we move through this, we're going to move kind of fast, and then we're going to slow down. And I might say some things that are fairly boring, but I think it's important to hit these high notes. And the first thing we're going to talk about is a thing called historiography. Now, if you have never taken a college history class, you may not have heard that word. Historiography is the study of history, the history of history, how historians have written about a subject over time. So you're not studying the subject itself, you're studying how that interpretation of that history has changed. And so let's take a look at the historiography of Elias Polk. Again, as long as people have been writing about James and Sarah Polk, they've been writing about Elias. One of the more modern works, they're starting to get better at it, I do believe. Lady First by Dr. Amy Greenberg. Fantastic book on Sarah Polk. Even though it's not about Elias Polk, it does mention him quite a bit more in that work than really all the others. And it really fleshes him out more than others. But prior to that work, the most modern, up-to-date book would be Jesse J. Holland's The Invisibles, The Untold Story of African American Slaves in the White House. Now, Holland himself is not a historian, he's a journalist. And it's a synthesis history, meaning that he didn't really use primary sources, he used a lot of secondary sources, a lot of books, pulling things together that other people have written. And if that's what you're doing, that's fine. It is a great overview. But what happens if the book you're using, maybe you shouldn't have used? Holland's main source of reference when talking about Elias Polk is 88 Years with Sarah Polk by Jimmy Lou Claxton, which came out in the 1970s. The intro to the book claims that she created it from her fertile imagination. She's upfront, it's fiction. Her main source of material to write this book was Young Hickory, The Life and Times of President James K. Polk by Martha McBride Morrell, which came out in the 1940s. It is also fiction. So you have a fiction novel influencing a fiction novel that became the source material, but Holland wasn't the only one that had done this. Anytime you see Elias Polk popping up, you usually see one of these three books. And while Holland's work does speak to some historical fact, its reference material most certainly does not. But what becomes of that? We have to understand the way that it was written about at the time is going to be influenced by a school of historical thought called the Dunning School, which came about in the late 1890s out of Columbia University. Eric Foner, who wrote the 1984 major book Reconstruction, which redefined that period of American history, refers to it as the politics of history. That you're never truly non-biased in your work. The way that you live in the culture that you're in is going to inherently influence how you write about something. People that are writing about James Polk 100 years ago are going to take a different interpretation than today and than 100 years from now. It's just how we are within our time periods. And the Dunning School really pulls that. It really focuses on Reconstruction, which is that period after the Civil War, and we're going to have to understand that as we go through this. The Dunning School is going to say that Reconstruction, that period after the Civil War, was a complete failure and it never should have happened because black people weren't ready to be free. But that was the main historical narrative for about 70 years in this country. That was what all the historians were writing about. That's what they were all saying, and that's what they really held on to. And Elias Polk gets caught up in that story. And so as we go through, we're going to break some of these myths, and we are going to get to the truth of who he is. So if you're ready, I'll show you a place that everyone here should know. I think it's right outside. Elias Polk, the truth of the matter, he was born here in 1806. Now, His parents, we have an idea of maybe who they are, but we don't quite know exactly who they are. On the property, as Scott mentioned, there were 5 enslaved people, Elias being one, being the infant. There were 2 enslaved women, Violet and Lucy, and then there were 2 unnamed enslaved men. Now, any combination of these 4 individuals would be Elias Polk's parents, but we don't actually know exactly what combination produced Elias himself. Now, 1806 is a big year for kind of this site, I guess, and the one in Columbia as well. 1806 is the year the Polk family leaves the area. That is the year that Samuel and Jane Polk pick up and then just move right on over. Come on in. Come on, they move all the way across the Appalachian Mountains to kind of the Duck River Valley of Middle Tennessee. So we're talking kind of this area right here is where they come from. Now, I made that trip yesterday. It was a 7.5-hour drive. I-40 is down to 1 lane, 35 miles an hour for 20 miles. And I had a lot of time to think in the car. And as I got more tired, I thought to myself, well, the Polks walked this, so I shouldn't complain too much. My trip is a lot easier today. But they move west looking for prosperity. Ezekiel Polk and some of the other Polks had moved there already and had been writing letters back. You kind of got to move to the area. So they settle in an area kind of called Neapolis, which is it was a 350-acre farm. It's between what is modern-day Spring Hill and Columbia, kind of an unincorporated area there. If you drive north from Columbia, Tennessee to Spring Hill along U.S. Highway 31, you'll see a plaque on the right-hand side that says Polk's Boyhood Home. That is all that is there. The house behind it was built in the 1920s, has nothing to do with the Polks. It's just the land it's referencing. But that is where the Polks are going to kind of start their lives in Tennessee. And it also becomes important to understand this concept of deference and how that is going to situate within Southern culture. The idea of deferring to someone maybe of a higher social status, higher economic bracket for patronage, protection, security, things like that. When the Polks first moved to Tennessee, they were not the wealthiest people in the area. They weren't the largest landowners. They didn't have the most money. They come in, they start working the land, white and black Polks alike, and then Samuel Polk starts working as a land surveyor. He starts getting connected to wealthier, more influential people. They start liking Samuel. He starts climbing the ladder. Hey, I did some work for you. Can I get something from you? And then eventually they own the first cotton gin in the area, which means now people have to come to them. And their wealth builds up. Their wealth builds up from there. Elias Polk is going to grow up on that property in Neapolis, that farm in Spring Hill area. And what is he watching? He's watching the relationship between enslaved people and those enslaving them, but he's also watching that relationship between wealthy white people and poor white people. That underlying current of deference is going to reinforce the master-slave relationship and the class relationship that he's seeing. That working within that channel is what made the Polks wealthy. And then when James K. Polk goes to college, when he goes back to North Carolina in 1814, they were rioting at UNC. It was a time where the professors could really control the students and really do anything they wanted. And there was a revolt. And James Polk gave a speech at UNC saying, don't do that. If you do what your professor wants, you might get an A. So that's kind of reinforcing in James Polk's mind too. Now, James Polk would come back to Columbia in 1816. By that point, Samuel Polk has left that area. He's now in Columbia, living in what is now the President James K. Polk Home and Museum in Columbia. Elias is still on the farm there. And we don't really know a lot about Elias Polk's early life, the first 18 years. We know he was born here and then moved west. One of the stories involves Andrew Jackson. Now, we also know that James K. Polk and Andrew Jackson are very closely connected. And of course, Elias would have met Andrew Jackson. He would have known Andrew Jackson to an extent. One of the stories that we have is roughly around 1814, passing through on his way to the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson stops at Samuel Polk's house in that Spring Hill area and has a meeting. While that's happening, Elias is watching his horse, and then when he leaves, Andrew Jackson gives him a 6 and 4 pence coin and tells him he did a good job and leaves. And that's a story that you see repeated quite a bit. But did it happen? Kind of comes from an obituary. Don't really have a reference of anybody that's involved in the story telling the story. And it happens about 70 years after it took place. But let's talk about this. Now keep this in mind because it's going to make sense later when we get past the Civil War. We talk about Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was the first Democratic president. He's the founder of the Democratic Party. He hands a coin, a symbol of wealth and patronage, to Elias Polk, who represented Southern African Americans at the time. I believe that story is nothing more than post-Civil War Reconstruction propaganda to make Jackson look benevolent as a slaveholder, to make the Democratic Party, who was the party at the time of the Confederacy, of enslavement, of secession, look like they're helping black people. And so if the founder of the Democratic Party is willing to do that, then maybe all Democrats would be willing to do that. And so you start seeing these narratives about Elias Polk start to pop up a lot towards the end of the 19th century, but that's about 10 years after he's dead, is when you start seeing people rewriting these things here. Now, he did know Andrew Jackson for sure, we know that, and he knew that through his connection to James and Sarah. Now, James and Sarah Polk are going to get married on New Year's Day, 1824 in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And they settle in just down the street from what is the Polk home in Columbia today. There's a parking lot for a funeral home. That's where their cottage was. Cottage is long gone. But not long after the couple were married, there was a report that a knock came to the door, and when they answered the door, there was Elias. He was there to let them know that, quote, "Old master told me to come here." It's the first quote we have from Elias Polk. And what he's saying in that is he is a wedding present to James and Sarah. He was part of what would have amounted to a set of a mule, a water cart, and the driver. And he is now going to spend at least the rest of James K. Polk's life with the Polks here. It's also around that time, 1824, that James Polk is starting to get more politically active. And he places Elias as his valet and body servant, so he's the one who's with James the most, standing kind of close to him, the closest there. And so he's with James a lot during the campaigns as they're moving all around kind of the country, the state of Tennessee, moving between Washington and Nashville, Washington and Columbia. And this is where we do have to get in and talk about the views of the Polks and slavery. James and Sarah Polk were slaveholders. James Polk once described the institution as, quote, "a matter of utmost caution." In his first, he was elected to Congress in 1824, took his seat in 1825. In his maiden address, the first speech James Polk ever gave to Congress, he discusses two things. Number one, he says we should abolish the Electoral College. And he says that because what happened in the election of 1824, you got 5 people running for president. It splits the votes 5 ways, down to 4 because John C. Calhoun drops out because he realized nobody was running for vice president. So he automatically got that job. Henry Clay comes in 4th, so he drops out. William Crawford has a stroke. It's down to Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. And because of the vote splitting, nobody got a majority. So according to the Constitution, what happens if there's not a majority in the Electoral College? The House of Representatives votes on it. Henry Clay hated Andrew Jackson. He's Speaker of the House. He gets John Quincy Adams elected president. Who's James K. Polk's mentor? Andrew Jackson. James K. Polk saying the Electoral College needs to be abolished is not because maybe he really believes it needs to be abolished. It's that idea of deference again. I'm deferring to Andrew Jackson. I'm saying what he wants to hear because his influence and power might help me out a little bit later. Later in the speech, he goes on to address slavery, a growing issue in the country. He does refer to it as a matter of utmost caution. James Polk does kind of this 19th century back and forth, these political bat flips you see, kind of like Thomas Jefferson. He talked about holding a wolf by the ears. You don't like it, but you're not going to let it go. James Polk is going to say that it is a common evil. He recognizes the morality of it. Common evil that was entailed upon us by our ancestors. And he says in that speech, his great fear is that his generation will impose it on the next. But then he goes on to argue that while enslaved people are people, they are a different species of human. And that they were created to work. And so you see that. He seems uncomfortable morally with it, but then he rationalizes it for economic purposes. Now, he's not the only one in the house with Elias. Sarah is going to take it from a more religious perspective, where James is focused on economics. If he's making money from it, that is his main focus, that is his main goal. Sarah grew up in a wealthier home. Sarah grew up in a house where she was waited on by enslaved people. Sarah's religion is going to influence this a lot. She's a Southern Presbyterian, which at the time was heavily influenced by Calvinism, so she believed in predestination, that God has already ordained where you are and what you are doing. If you were going to heaven or hell, that was decided long before you were born. There's a story that James Polk wrote 5 individual times that we found. They're sitting in the White House. James is writing. Sarah's fanning herself, doing needlepoint, whatever she's doing. She puts down what she's doing. She looks up and she goes, I've been thinking. They got it wrong when they wrote the Declaration of Independence. And James puts his quill down and goes, okay, you're First Lady. Please explain. And she goes, not all men were created equal. You're President. I'm First Lady. We're wearing nice clothes. We have all the wealth and trappings we could ever want, and we didn't ask for it. She points to an enslaved person. He didn't ask for his lot in life neither, but God has made him for it. So, think about if an enslaved person runs away from a Polk property. How does James Polk view that? That is a loss of income. How does Sarah Polk view that? That is sacrilegious. You're violating what God has placed you to do. And so Elias is having to navigate these two views of his condition, his situation. And he does it really masterfully. James K. Polk, again, is elected to the U.S. Congress in 1825. Leaves in 1839 to be governor of the state of Tennessee. Now, he would serve as governor for 1 term before losing twice. During that time, Elias is back and forth from Washington with him. He's standing there, he's watching him, he's watching Polk's ascent, he's watching Polk's rise, and then he also watches Polk lose. When he's not with James Polk, he's tending to small gardens in Columbia. We have reference of that in some of the letters, the Polk papers. Nothing at this point is coming from him directly. It's what kind of the white people around him are writing about to each other. Elias did this, Elias did that, he's here, he's there. One of the stories we have is there was an ox that James Polk had that died, and there was a debate on the farm between James Walker, who was James K. Polk's brother-in-law, who at the time I think was also mayor of Columbia, about what to do. Elias thinks one should be bought. Walker thinks that Elias should go work for Franklin Polk, another one of James's brothers, in exchange for an ox to be rented. Now we know Elias would eventually go work for Franklin Polk and the ox would be rented, but the fact that Elias's voice is even in that kind of tells you where he is at that point in time and what he is doing. Now, James Polk, as we know, runs for president in 1844 against Henry Clay. And what does Elias Polk do in the campaign? He plays a small role. This is not really a time where you're campaigning for yourself. James Polk never went door to door. He never gave a big stump speech when he was running for president in 1844. You would have other people who would do that for you. And it's very important to kind of get messages back and forth. Elias, his job was to take messages between Columbia and Nashville. That is about a 40-mile either walk or ride on horseback. Took 12 hours at the time. So his job is to go back and forth carrying kind of mail. Now, one thing that we do know from this time period is a story that also plays into this idea here is Elias is riding a horse, and the horse kind of stumbles and it hurts its leg. And Elias is now very concerned. He has injured a horse. How is he going to get back to Columbia? He happens to be near the home of John Catron. Anyone know who that is? Don't worry, I didn't know who either. I had to look him up. John Catron, at the time, was a member of the U.S. Supreme Court who lived in Nashville. He had been appointed to the Supreme Court by Andrew Jackson. His wife was Matilda Childress, Sarah Polk's cousin. Elias stops at the home, tells him what's happened. He is allowed to take one of Catron's horses back to Columbia, and Catron's going to take care of the horse until it's healed enough to go back to James. This is the end of the letter that Catron sent to James Polk about it. The horse is shod, feeding on oats. My people ride him in and out of the farm, and I think he is better recovered than any horse so badly foundered I have ever known. Send for him any time 3 days hence. This especially for Elias's comfort. In all of the Polk papers, every letter, every document we've seen, this is the only time any person is concerned about the well-being of an enslaved person. But again, ask yourself this, is it really about Elias Polk? They're Jacksonians. Polk is taking up the mantle of Jackson. It's about the horse. It's about James Polk's property. Not really about Elias. There's the family connection, there's the political connection, there's the idea that James Polk might be president of the United States. So is it really about Elias Polk? Maybe to some point, but the rest of the letter is all about, when you're president, what we can do together. And then it ends with that. Of course, James Polk wins the presidency, becomes president March 4th, 1845. And there's an interesting story about the time that this happens. So the way the story goes, and I'm just going to check on time because I can get carried away pretty good. Well, I'm good. I love this image, by the way. This is the first image ever taken of the White House by a man named John Plum. It's a daguerreotype. It was taken during the Polk administration. These three windows there with the shades on the far right, that was James Polk's offices. He put the shades up so it would be more constant light the entire time as to not fluctuate, changing light during his working hours. One of the stories, in fact the most repeated story from this time with Elias Polk, is about Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. The story goes is that not long after becoming president, Elias went to the White House with the Polks. Of course, James and Elias take a trip to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, which is not that far from Washington, D.C., and they end up staying the night there. The next morning, they get up, James is getting ready, Elias goes out to the stable, he's readying the horses, and a couple of guys walk up to him and he goes, "Hey, you know, Elias, you are enslaved to the president." And Elias says, "Yes, I am." And they say, "You know Pennsylvania is a free state. You are not enslaved here, you can leave. And the president can't do anything to you." And Elias tells them, "Why would I do that?" And then he chooses to stay. And then James Polk overheard the conversation and tells Elias, "You have been so loyal, I will give you your freedom." And Elias refuses it. Now you might have kind of caught on to what we're doing here. Did that story probably happen? No. Let's ask some questions about it. That was reported a lot, especially after Elias Polk died. So what does the story do? It makes James Polk look very benevolent and very caring. It makes Elias Polk look complicit in his own enslavement. He chose to be a slave at that point. So whose fault is it that Elias is a slave? It's not the Polks. It's Elias after that story. Does the president ever travel alone? No. President Polk is one of the most documented presidents of the 19th century. He kept a meticulous diary and correspondence. He never went to Wilkes-Barre. James Polk took 27 days off his 4 years in office. He's the president with the least amount of vacation time. He wouldn't have just went. He didn't do it. And what we actually have record of is Elias Polk wasn't even there. While this story, that story didn't happen at all. It is complete fiction, made to push an idea, made to push a narrative. Again, that Dunning School influencing how we're going to view American history and how we look at American history. So just because you have a source from the time period, you still have to do the who, what, when, where, and why. Who wrote it? Why did they write it? When did they write it? And what was it for? Elias was rented out. James Polk comes into the presidency. He understands the political volatility of the issue of slavery. He, as Speaker of the House, issues the gag rule, which meant you could bring anything before debate in Congress except slavery. He referred to it as a matter of utmost caution. He knew that once you start debating slavery, you will not be able to move on past that. So let's just ignore it. So James Polk tries to have as few enslaved people at the White House as he can to project that image. Only one enslaved Polk is going to be there the entire time. His name is Henry Carter Jr. He was an enslaved man from the West Tennessee plantation that had been brought in. And then he would also rent enslaved people to work alongside free African Americans and white people he would hire. Most notably, one of the slaves that James Polk had rented during the time was, can't think of the name, it escapes me right now, but it was the enslaved man from Dolly Madison who wrote a book. Paul Jennings. Paul Jennings, he wrote a book after his emancipation there. Elias is living in Murray County. He is under a rental contract. So James and a guy named James Houston Thomas, who was a one-time law partner of James Polk, signed a contract that said James Houston Thomas needs more enslaved people, but he doesn't have the money or the investments to buy enslaved people, so he will rent their labor for $80 a year. Elias is going to go live and work with James Houston Thomas. Well, James Houston Thomas ends up getting elected to Congress. And so Thomas in 1846 goes to D.C. The contract is transferred to the Nelson's House Hotel, to a Mr. Matthews that ran the place. It's still standing. That's what it looks like there. It's a law office today. And so what you start seeing is Elias is kind of being shuffled around. He's staying in Murray County almost the entire time that James and Sarah are at the White House under that slave rental there. Slavery was changing by that point. Renting enslaved people was more common than the sale and purchase of enslaved people, and it was opening up to a more lower class through this, and Elias Polk gets caught up in that. Now, in 1849, James and Sarah leave the White House. They retire from the presidency. They decide they don't want to go back to that little cottage that's now a parking lot in Columbia. They've been President and First Lady. They buy this home. It was a home called Grundy Place. It was originally the home of Felix Grundy, the Attorney General of the United States, who had taught Polk law. They had done some work to it, changing it from federal to Greek Revival style. 1847 they buy it. They move into it in 1849. Elias and Matilda, who were two enslaved people that worked in Columbia, were brought to Nashville to prepare the house, while Mariah, another enslaved person, was brought in, and Henry Carter is going to travel back with the Polks from D.C. So it is this home and 4 enslaved people living on the property. Remember, the Polks were absentee owners. There's about, over Polk's entire career, about 200 enslaved people, but they're going to live on various properties. West Tennessee, Mississippi, that Spring Hill farm. Very few actually live in the home with the Polks, which also makes Elias just a little bit different. So that is actually the floor plan drawn in a letter to James Polk by the architect that was renovating the house for them. So you see the size of Polk Place for 2 people. That's the enslaved quarters right there. While James and Sarah took up residence in Polk Place, they decorated it with Empire-style sofas, gentlemen's chairs, rosewood frames covered in rich red velvet and silk upholstery, 33 side chairs donned, the 2 large parlors, heavy gold and silk, draped curtains. The cabin for the enslaved was a crude frame wooden building that stood 18 by 33 by 10 feet. divided down the middle to make 2 rooms for 4 enslaved people. And this is where Elias is going to live for kind of the next maybe decade and a half or so. Now, as we all know, James Polk also has the shortest retirement of any president. About 103 days after leaving office, he passes away through a cholera epidemic. Matilda, the cook, dies first. That's probably most likely because she's handling the food and the water. Cholera comes through dirty water, dirty food. So her handling that probably is where that came into the home. She dies first. 2 weeks later, June 15th, 1849, James Polk passes away. We don't know what Elias was doing at that time. We really don't. Some people have... 88 Years with Sarah Polk has this whole dramatic scene in it where Elias is wailing and crying in the hallway, and Sarah has to console him, the widow. But again, that was fiction. That probably really didn't happen there. But it's going to be at Polk Place. Elias is going to remain enslaved to Sarah for the next 16 years. And Sarah Polk now is in charge of the slave holdings. All of them. All the properties. Everything. When James Polk was alive, the plantations had roughly a 46% infant mortality rate. And one of the West Tennessee property had one of the highest rates of runaways in the state of Tennessee. So that tells you something about the conditions. But how did James Polk view slavery different than Sarah? When Sarah becomes slaveholder, that 46% infant mortality rate rises to 51%. And runaways become more often. Actually, in 1856, there was a slave rebellion on her Mississippi plantation where all the slaves rose up. Eventually, it was put down by a white militia. But that kind of shows you how Sarah is dealing with this. Elias is living there with Sarah, still tending to the white Polks. We have the Civil War. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know a lot about the Civil War in North Carolina. Didn't study that, not from here. But I can tell you what the Polks were doing in Tennessee. Tennessee was the last state to secede. And as I mentioned to, where's Tracy? There you are. I told them all about those 3 stars on the Tennessee state flag, East, Middle, and West Tennessee. It's culturally, geographically, and historically different. East Tennessee is where the Appalachian Mountains are. Tends to be, at the time, a little bit more Whig, a little bit more Republican. Middle Tennessee, you got a mix as you come off those rolling hills. Good for tobacco. West Tennessee, you got that Mississippi River Valley. The time, a lot of Democrats out there, a lot of enslaved people, and you see Confederate sympathy grow as you move east to west in the state of Tennessee. So Tennessee is going to be very conflicted as they go into the Civil War. June of 1861, we leave the Union. February of 1862, we fall to the Union. So about 8 months, Tennessee was a Confederate state. Sarah Polk is going to be living through pretty much all of the 19th century. And Elias is going to notice something about Sarah here. Sarah, during the Civil War, is professing neutrality. I will not pick a side. I am a Southern woman, but I am also a former First Lady. My husband was President of the United States. Well, that's the problem with Sarah, is she was very pro-Confederate. And she didn't hide it. She was president of the Soldiers and Friends Society, which gave aid and raised money for Confederate soldiers. She raised money at a banquet for a portrait to be commissioned of Jefferson Davis. And she even was sewing clothes for Confederate soldiers. And yet, she's still giving off this perception that she's neutral. Elias watches that you can do one thing and say another, and people might believe the other thing. People still don't do that today, do they? But no, so Sarah's doing this. Elias is watching it happen. And then in 1862, this guy comes to Nashville. His name is Don C. Buell. He's a Union general. He calls on Sarah. He goes to Polk Place. This is recorded in a book called Memorials of Sarah Childress Polk, written in 1890. 1890, I think, is when it was published, maybe 92. It was done through a series of interviews. Anson and Fannie Nelson interviewed Sarah Polk at the end of her life, and then compiled the book published after she died. In the book, she mentions when General Don Buell came to Polk place. He called on her, showed up with an entourage of Union soldiers. They're entertained by Sarah. They have a good time. And as they're leaving, they see Elias out in the yard. And one of the Union officers asks Elias Polk, "Sir, what do you think of this war?" And Elias's answer is a little bit interesting. I am for the rights of the South and the territories. Again, I think you may know where I'm going with this one. A lot of memorials is factual, but this story in particular caught my attention. How would Sarah know that? In the story, Sarah's in the house. This takes place in the yard. And the end of the story, the Union is riding down the road, and about a mile away, they talk about it. Unless Sarah Polk has super hearing, I don't think she heard what two guys were saying to each other a mile away. Again, that comes from the 1890s, that time period we talk about where Elias Polk's image starts to become a little bit distorted. And this takes us into Reconstruction. Reconstruction is that period after the Civil War. Now, all of that stuff before, it's kind of what white people have said in passing about Elias Polk, me going, okay, this story's here and it's told a lot, but is it real? But there might be something to some of these stories here. Because now we have more records of Elias Polk. We have his own words coming through now. We have him doing his things. When the Civil War ended, slavery was abolished. Tennessee was actually exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation. Tennessee was already under Union control, and the Emancipation Proclamation only took effect in states currently in rebellion. And Tennessee was not considered in rebellion at the time, so slavery could continue to exist past the Emancipation Proclamation in the state of Tennessee. But after the 13th Amendment, Elias Polk gets his freedom and begins working kind of for himself. The Republican Party at the time is arguing, you are now free, you can argue for and get a labor contract and get paid for the work you do. Elias Polk is 60 years old. Who's going to hire a 60-year-old man to work their field? He's illiterate, he's black, he's not going to get the kind of jobs that he might be able to. But what has he watched his entire life? He's watched that system of deference. He's watched systems of patronage. He watched family connections get in there. He adopts the last name Polk. He leverages that last name. And he is going to begin a very interesting oratorical and political career. He is going to be the president of the Colored Democratic Club, the Colored Seymour and Blair Club, the Colored Men for Greeley, the Colored Tilden and Hendricks Club, the Independent Colored Conservative National Club. He becomes Tennessee's first black conservative. He does speeches across the South supporting the rights of ex-Confederates. At a time when a vast majority of African Americans who are now getting the right to vote, being politically active, are joining the Republican Party. Understandably, that's the party of Lincoln, that's the party of the Union, that's the party of emancipation. You don't really see a lot of former slaves supporting the Democratic Party and the Confederates and the former enslavers. Elias Polk was able to work within those Democratic channels. He was able to leverage the last name Polk. And in an interesting way, he was able to gain a sense of autonomy, of personal security, and economic stability in a world designed to oppress him. However, he did that by working with the very people that are seeking to oppress him. His political career is going to kind of take from these two methods here, Jeffersonian liberalism and classical conservatism. They're very different than what we would say liberal and conservative is today. These are more 19th century. He's going to combine that idea of paternalism that former enslavers and slaveholders and Confederates have talked about, that it's paternalism. We were taking care of enslaved people. So Elias Polk says, okay, if that's what you want to do, then do it. Take care of them. He is going to focus on individual collectivism, is the way I describe it, which sounds like it's an oxymoron there. That you yourself are responsible for you, but you need to work in channels of people like you. He is separating kind of a black working class within that. This is a speech he gave in 1866. In it he says, "My heart beats with alarm when I contemplate the dangers of the country." What were these dangers? They were enslaving white people by driving them from the ballot box and making hostility and enmity between the blacks and whites. We must make all free, for we cannot live in peace any other way. Who do you think he's talking to? An all-white crowd of Southern Democrats, former Confederates. He's telling them what they want to hear. But what else is he doing? Do Democrats of the 1800s want black people to vote? No. Is Elias Polk saying, give them back their rights, give them the vote so they can take away mine? They would love him to say that. He doesn't. Elias is going to present the forwardness of black rights almost in a way that's palatable to a white supremacist. That, hey, white people need the right to vote, just like I do. You actually see those letters quite a bit. There was a lot of petitions going to Nashville at the time for Governor Brownlow had disenfranchised all people who had fought for the Confederacy. And you see a lot of letters actually petitioning the state during that time. But what you also see is an argument that Booker T. Washington is going to make in the 1890s. Elias Polk makes the same argument 30 years earlier. The opportunity to earn $1 in a factory just now is worth infinitely more than the opportunity to spend $1 in the Opera House. That is, Booker T. Washington has been criticized in more modern times for his pacification and accommodationist views when it came to white society. The idea was if African Americans work within their own channels, if they build themselves economically, if they leave politics alone, then eventually white people will realize that, oh, they're just like we are, and give them all the rights that they have deserved. Well, we needed a civil rights movement in the 1960s to get close to that. So it ends up not working. It's a practical thing that you start seeing mostly happening in the South. Think about Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois live in the North. They don't face kind of the same threats and challenges that Booker T. Washington and Elias Polk are going to. Elias Polk, while giving political speeches, is going to tell African Americans, quote, leave the white man's politics alone. At a political rally, he's saying, don't do this. And it becomes the foundation of what is Southern black conservatism of the 19th century, and it's all done as a form of pragmatism and a form of safety and security in a world designed to oppress him. And what we see is what's so interesting about it is, does he even himself really believe that? Elias Polk was the vice president of the Tennessee Colored Agricultural Mechanical Association. They were a black vocational, they created schools and vocational training and vocational schools. The co-vice president and treasurer with Elias Polk is the guy cast in bronze in the back. His name is Samson Keeble. Samson Keeble was the first African American ever elected to the Tennessee state legislature. He was a Republican. He fought for black rights. But he's friends with and works with Elias Polk. In 1871, Elias Polk was made chair of the Fair Committee. This was a huge thing. They had thousands and thousands of people brought in from around the country to see this fair. It was an exposition. They were showing off new mechanics buffed by African Americans, new agricultural techniques by African Americans, really showcasing black knowledge. Elias Polk, who we've seen what he says and how he's acting, books Frederick Douglass to be the keynote speaker at the first one. Frederick Douglass comes to Nashville, stands on a stage next to Elias Polk and gives a speech about how great this fair is and how it is dispelling the myths of the African American community. A paper in Pennsylvania reported it later by saying that anyone who attended the fair has lost some sense of their prejudice. Elias Polk is also, while raising money and opening schools and engaged in a lot of black social and educational uplift, he is going to take a lot of the money that these, again, white supremacists, that's the only way to really describe, they're paying him to give these speeches and lead these things. We have more than one account of him bailing black men out of jail before they could be lynched. And I keep looking for a family connection to any of them. Can't find one. So is it like Booker T. Washington, who had the public persona and what he was doing in private? Is it like what Sarah Polk did during the Civil War? What Elias had been taught to do is do one thing and say another. Keep that public image up, and maybe you can get something out of that. He's investing a lot in there. Now, it gets him a job. In 1870, this guy here, John Calvin Brown, is elected governor of the state of Tennessee. John C. Brown is from Pulaski, Tennessee. Anyone know what happened in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1866? The Ku Klux Klan was formed. John C. Brown was a member. John C. Brown was a former Confederate. He becomes governor. He appoints Elias Polk to work at the state capitol, to work for the Senate. Anyone know who John C. Brown's wife is? Her name is Betty Brown. She was founding president of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. She was Sarah Polk's niece. She lived at Polk Place during the Civil War with Elias. He's hired on at $60 a month in 1870. That is a lot of money. By 1870 census, Elias Polk is worth $5,000 personally, his estate. He's making a lot of money. He's climbing that ladder. And he gets a lot of critics for it. This is a guy named T. Morris Chester. He in himself could be a whole program. He was the first black war correspondent in U.S. history, came down with the Union during the Civil War and was reporting for newspapers in the North. He then leaves the United States, goes to England and becomes the first black lawyer in the history of England. Moves back to the United States, lives in Louisiana, and now he's a Republican orator going around the country delivering speeches. And in 1871, he gives a speech in Bowling Green, Kentucky. I'm going to read a piece of it here. He says at this speech, it's celebrating the end of slavery in the Caribbean. He says, "I have understood that in this state, which clings more tenaciously to slavery than any other, that there is a black man from Tennessee who is now canvassing the state in the interest of the white man's party. It is hardly possible to conceive a greater crime or deeper ingratitude than to see a black man born whose back or that of his blood kin has felt the lash of oppression, of which the white man's party is the champion, who has heard the dying groans and shrieks of our brethren who have been murdered by slavery, who in his own person has suffered every indignity which slave laws and slave public sentiment inflicted, advising black men to vote their liberty away and by solemn acts surrender their manhood. May this wretch who renders the name Elias Polk enjoy the contempt for which his depravity merits. May he receive the ineffable brand of a traitor, so that all good men and women may scorn him whenever he appears. May the church of which he is a member expel him in disgrace as being unworthy to associate with a Christian people. May every black race that he meets shun him as a lonesome toad and hissing viper. May our colored soldiers who fought for liberty and equal rights get this fraud upon humanity into their quiet keeping. May he be stumped all over this land by the stumps of black men who have left parts of limbs on every field of glory. May he exist through the time as one of God's judgments upon the earth. May he never die as a warning to humanity, cursed by angels, cursed by men, and cursed by demons, as a traitor to God, his race, and the genuine enlightened liberty to which let all people say amen, amen, thrice amen."
That's a curse.
I cut out a lot of that too. It's understandable why people would have a problem with Elias Polk. What he's saying, what he's out there doing. He goes to Evansville, Indiana at one point and gives a speech there. It turns into a debate. It's a great story. Evansville hated Elias Polk for decades after. He comes out there, gives a speech telling people to vote for Hendricks and Tilden, and in the election of 1876, a black Republican stands up and starts arguing with Elias Polk. And people start to realize that when you get him off of his scripted narrative, he kind of doesn't really know what he's doing. And he starts arguing about black rights and who gave it to them. And again, Evansville just, for years after, they bring it up and just keep going. In 1876, he gets appointed to the U.S. Capitol to work as a laborer. He had gotten to George Adams through a guy named Samuel Donaldson, who was a relative of Andrew Jackson. Again, that patronage system there. And in 1881, he loses his job when the Republicans take over the House of Representatives. In fact, it was such a big deal that Elias Polk was fired that this guy, the clerk of the House, Edward McPherson, in 1882 was interviewed and was asked specifically why was Elias Polk fired. Republican Party pressure really is what came down upon him. He returns to Tennessee in the 1880s and he gets married. He married a woman named Mary Mansfield, who he met while working at the Treasury Department. She worked at the Treasury Department, he worked at the Capitol. At the cloakroom, they get married. She is 41 years younger than he is. So it still happens today, I guess. Almost a caretaker situation at that point, really. In 1880, he becomes the first African American to address a state convention in Tennessee. He was in a segregated building, and they suspended the rules to allow him to speak. He spoke about state credit and how Sarah Polk owned all these rail bonds, and the state was trying to decide if we should pay the bonds or not. Do we just default on the debt and act like it didn't happen, or we pay it? The Democratic Party ends up splitting over that issue, and a Republican becomes governor, which means Elias Polk isn't going to get any work for a while. So he becomes a hack driver, which is kind of the 19th century version of a taxi cab. In 1886, he and Mary, they're in a lot of debt. They need money. They go to D.C. one last time. We're going to make one last push at getting a job. He meets President Grover Cleveland at the White House, the first Democrat since the Civil War to be elected. He tours the White House. He gives a tour of the White House. He meets President Cleveland. He was interviewed afterwards, and they asked him, "What'd you think about President Cleveland?" He said, "He's a Democrat of the old school, and yes, he's old enough to marry a young woman." Cleveland was the first president to get married in office. His wife was 21 when he got married. With Elias's age difference with his wife, it makes sense there. Elias Polk then retires. He goes back to his hotel where he and Mary are going to hang out. He has been notified with Samuel Donaldson again that the Democrats have just taken the House of Representatives back over. He is going to get his job back. They celebrate. And the next morning, Mary wakes up and finds Elias has died. Hemorrhage of the lungs is what he ended up dying from. It was reported across the country. From California, every state. I have found a newspaper article in every state that existed at the time about Elias Polk's death. The one in Evansville mentioned that nobody cared. They really didn't like him in Evansville. Elias was in a lot of debt. His wife was now the one who had to pay it. She didn't have the money. She had to mortgage the home and sell the carriage to just pay off the debts. Didn't have enough money to bring his body back to Tennessee. Sarah Polk talked to Samuel Donaldson and got a temporary vault at Graceland Cemetery for Elias. But it's now Mary's job to raise the money. Elias Polk's legacy of deference to white Democratic elites is not going to stop with him. Now Mary is going to be forced to do it to bring his body back. She takes out ads in newspapers around the country appealing to Democrats to bring Elias home. Eventually the money was raised. 2 months later, his body was brought back by train. There was a small service at Clark Memorial Chapel. A guy who had once been a almost national figure had a handful of people attend the funeral. Elias Polk's legacy is one that is almost a little uncomfortable to tell. That headstone was placed in 2017. at Nashville City Cemetery. He was buried in the first integrated plot in the cemetery. From life to death and even beyond, Elias Polk deferred to others in the pursuit of economic security and political survival. By soothing the fears and reinforcing the expectations of powerful white Democrats, he managed for a time to carve out limited autonomy, protection, and influence in a society that oppressed black Americans. To many, his career epitomizes the concept of selling out, a man who played into and perpetuated racial stereotypes for personal gain. In many ways, this is an accurate assessment of his life. But Elias Polk built his position on loyalty to white men who had no true interest in black advancement, and he worked against the political progress of his own people in the name of patronage and survival. But to dismiss his choices as mere betrayal oversimplifies the realities of the world in which he lived. Elias Polk lived in an era where bold defiance could mean death and where calculated submission could mean survival. He did not seek martyrdom or radical change. Instead, he sought to live and operate within the system as it existed, forcing white supremacists to uphold their self-professed paternalistic obligations. He was a Southern black conservative in a world that offered him few paths forward. His story is one of contradictions. He was a man who both accepted the racial hierarchy and manipulated it. He worked for a party that sought to disenfranchise black men, yet demanded its protection, and built a life of deference but refused to disappear entirely. In the end, Elias Polk did not fight for revolution. He fought to exist on his own terms. And while many may find his methods distasteful or troubling, they were, in their own way, a strategy for survival in a world designed against him. Does anyone have any questions? I threw a lot at you right there.
There's a tremendous amount of information here. One of the more interesting things about it is how much of this historical knowledge and understanding has evolved really over the last 15 years. If way back when we first began to talk about the state sites and the role of African Americans in the state sites and whatever else, we raised these interesting issues, and the amount of information that was out there for Elias was scant. It was terrible. Wikipedia was completely wrong. So some of our folks did some of the original evaluation of this, and those are the very first cogent measures of the story. One of the things that's probably, now you understand, I'm approaching 75, so in many ways I'm becoming something of an historical artifact in my own. How much of this has changed, and how much America has changed in my lifetime. I was born in 1950. That was a very, very different world from what it is today, and we still have, well, I won't go into the modern world at all at this point, but this was the very first time that people began to really pull, people use historical disciplines to find the documents, to find the things, to question the things, all of the things that you've talked about. At varying points in time, these were accepted as true, except maybe they weren't.
Yeah, and it's like I mentioned Eric Foner at the beginning, the politics of history, that when you write something inherently, no matter how objective you try to be, you're living in a certain time period. You can't escape that. And there was a concerted effort after about the 1890s through maybe the 1960s. You see an effort almost to whitewash, sanitize, or just completely fabricate the history. We saw that with a lot of what was written about Elias Polk, whether it's full books and works or whether it's little articles. That Wilkes-Barre story, that was published in the Wyoming Valley Journal of History in Pennsylvania. So I mean, these things are getting put out there. They're getting repeated. It's only within the last even maybe decade that Elias Polk specifically is being looked into in that way. And it can also be understandable why Elias Polk wouldn't have been. President Polk was there. He's going to be overshadowed greatly. I mean, we all know who James Polk is. If you went out on the street and you asked somebody who James Polk is, how many are going to be able to tell you? But how many people can tell you Andrew Jackson? Polk is overshadowed by Andrew Jackson in the same way that Elias is going to be overshadowed by James Polk. And so there was a lot of digging, a lot of uncovering to do. And then even when you find something, having to go back into that and figure out, okay, was it true? What does it mean, even when it is true? And what you find is Elias Polk wasn't the only one doing this. Enslaved people to Andrew Jackson, Hannah Jackson, did the exact same thing. The only difference was is the moment she had the opportunity to leave the hermitage, she did and then said everything I said was a lie. Albert Johnson, an enslaved person to Andrew Johnson, does the same thing. It's that leveraging of the Polk name. It gave him some security. And interesting, it's an overtly racist time in American history, so when they're talking about black people in newspapers and things, they are just very blatantly using the N-word. Except for Elias Polk. They will use euphemisms for Elias Polk. It's, even in the same article, the same guy writing will talk about people he's associating with and use the word, but not for him. It's that idea of if you criticize Elias Polk, you're criticizing the Polk family. And so he gets in that. So it's a lot of research done. It's a lot of research continue to do as that idea of the Southern black political movement of the late 19th century is kind of being pulled out at this point. And it's a whole new thing that a lot of people haven't really been looking into lately. But yeah, it's a fun thing to do. Yeah.
Did anything happen to his wife after he passed?
Yeah, Mary is going to, she mortgages the house, so she's going to pay the bill. She works a couple odds and end jobs, and within about 3 years of Elias dying, she passes away as well. She gets sick and dies. Yeah, so not very long. She's buried next to him in City Cemetery.
Is that City Cemetery in Nashville?
Yes, yeah, Nashville City Cemetery. It's the oldest cemetery in Nashville. It's where James Polk was originally buried. He died of cholera, so they had to bury him within 24 hours. And he was buried next to Felix Grundy in the plot there. And then 9 months later, Sarah had him dug up and brought to Polk Place. Then, about 40 years later, was taken to the Capitol.
Zach, have you run into anybody in your travels or your presentations or your studies that has done this much extensive work on Elias Polk?
No.
Wow. Yeah, that's why Wikipedia kind of acknowledges you as the expert.
It's when you're the only one driving a boat, you're the best one driving the boat.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
Did he speak on the Black Codes at all?
I'm sorry?
Did he speak on the Black Codes at all?
No, never saw anything on that.
Or the Freeman's Bureau?
Again, never saw anything about that on that one. He doesn't get into, he never, and everything he says, he never disparages black rights. He never says take them away. He never says they shouldn't do it. He just argues that you should do it in a way that is working within an already established racial hierarchy. Which also makes sense with Sarah Polk's view of the world. What he was kind of raised under, that predestination, she believes white above black, men above women. That was instilled in him. So he never does that, but he does say things. He goes after Governor Brownlow quite a bit, but he only goes after him personally, not politically. Brownlow was the one who gave African Americans the right to vote in Tennessee. So no, he never makes comment on that. But I also believe he probably wouldn't have, as he doesn't want to upset his money base that's coming in there. You had a question in the back.
2 questions. One's real quick. Was he illiterate his whole life?
Yes.
Okay.
His marriage license, if you noticed, in 1882, it's an X, and then someone wrote Elias Polk over his name.
Okay. And then could you speak a little bit toward what the contemporary views of America was on the Polk administration during Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction?
Yeah. He becomes very defensive, and everybody at Polk Place becomes defensive. James Polk is not a popular president at the end of the Civil War. He is not. Robert E. Lee said that had he known we were going to war with Mexico, probably would have not joined the army. Ulysses S. Grant in his memoirs referred to the war with Mexico as a wicked war, stating that God punishes nations like he punishes people. The Civil War was our punishment for what we did to Mexico.
Wow.
It's that idea of before James Polk, you had a balance of free and enslaved states in the country. You had an equal number. You saw one come in, you saw another come in. James Polk leaves office, we've got 30 states. Well, he adds Texas, we're going to add Oregon. That's why that was important. He knew Texas was going to be a slave state, so we need to go after the Oregon Territory for a free state because we got to keep that balance because you don't want one side to have more power than the other. James Polk's whole thing was to ignore the issue and try to keep it out of the limelight. He adds 1.19 million square miles of land to the country. And the united country in taking Mexican land and English Oregon, well, what is that land going to be now? The North sees free states, the South sees slave states. They start arguing. Why are the 1850s the most volatile time in the 19th century? They're all fighting over Polk's land.
Yeah.
What does Lincoln say? Lincoln, when he was campaigning for president, never said, I'm going to free slaves. He said, I'm going to keep it from going west. It can stay where it is. I'm not going to let it go west. James Polk becomes the flashpoint and the scapegoat for a lot of people in the 1870s and 60s. They look back and go, well, man, if James Polk hadn't have done that, then we probably wouldn't have had the Civil War and all of that. So his reputation was not very good at the time. So you see people like Sarah and then Sally Fall, who was a niece, and then Elias, almost becoming very defensive over that and really talking him up. And then it would be later in the 20th century that his reputation would start to kind of build back up to what it is today. But he was not very popular after the Civil War itself.
You know, I often wondered if he would have joined during Reconstruction the other black Republicans who rose to power. You talk about South Carolina, Louisiana, and all these southern states, right, where people were positioned to continue some very influential things. How he could have, because to my understanding, he would have been perhaps one of the, if he was to run for a high position from a Congress standpoint, or what have you, how influential he could have leveraged that surname in the continued advancement of black folks.
Yeah, so
right? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I want to hear that.
And so in not doing that, and I'm looking at this from a psychological lens, when you have individuals who aren't used to seeing black folk in power, but you see him getting preferential treatment, right? And then gets into the White House and getting paid $60 a month, which is probably more than a lot of these folks were getting. And then the purge happens. So he tried to teeter back and forth, but it's always going to catch up to you. It always catches up to you when you try to do that in these United States, because there's no gray area, unfortunately, in this country. There's either black or white, and I am saying that pun is intended. Right? And so I'm just curious, your thoughts on how you feel things could have potentially played out for him if he leveraged that.
So there's a very interesting thing there. So number one, I don't think he could have leveraged the Polk name in the Republican Party. The Republicans are made up a lot of the old Whigs, and the Republicans themselves did not like James Polk. Abraham Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846 specifically to oppose the war in Mexico. So I don't think he would have had as easy of a time working within Republican channels as he did Democratic channels, using that name in that specific way. His political philosophy also centered around that idea of deference to the Democratic white elite. So the idea was lead but not be a leader. He did attempt at one point to run for state office in Tennessee. It never made it past a headline. While the Democratic white elite was willing to put Elias Polk there to show off, hey, we've got a black friend, they're not going to put him in charge of anything. Tennessee also, I'd also believe that it goes into his, the state he's in. When he's in Congress, when he works at the Capitol, that is the same time that you've got Robert Smalls, you've got Bruce K. Blanche. He is watching Republican that's when the first you start seeing black people get elected to Congress the first time. Every single one of them are Republicans. Every one of them are. Elias is there representing the Democratic Party. You've got senators and congressmen representing the Republican Party. That is a noticeable difference in that there. But where Mississippi and South Carolina where Blanche and Smalls are coming from, we're still under Reconstruction. Tennessee never really had a Reconstruction. We were exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation. Brownlow became governor, and then Center took over very quickly after. And then we have the 1870 is when the new Constitution is kind of written in the state of Tennessee that kind of changes all those rules. Elias Polk wouldn't have had the same level of protections. That's why we don't see any congressional black Republicans coming out of the state of Tennessee. Tennessee has only ever had one, even today, only ever had one African American in Congress. That was Harold Ford from Memphis. He's the only African American to ever represent Tennessee in any House of Congress. So in the state he lived in, with the name he had, I don't think he would have been able to do it within the Republican Party, the way he was able to do it in the Democratic Party, and leveraging that. But even, you're not going to rise very highly in the Democratic Party, but it was more about economics than it was maybe influence.
I just got real quick questions to clarify really something. How long was Elias actually in the White House, or was he?
He made the initial trip, helped them get set up, and then came right back.
Okay, so he was there just a matter of months?
Months, yeah, a couple months, and then left. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Did he keep up a friendship with Mrs. Polk?
Yes, he kind of goes back and forth from Polk Place a little bit. Friendship is an interesting word because they don't tend to have that relationship. He speaks of her when it's kind of necessary. I don't see anything personal he's saying about her. It's very, the Democratic Party should make sure that she gets paid. The Democratic Party, when he meets with President Cleveland, he talks about Sarah Polk because she's alive and she's a connection to the White House. He usually makes a joke that she's 3 years older than he is, but he looks older than her. That's kind of the joke he makes. Sarah only references him as a faithful servant. So he kind of pops in and out of Polk Place at times, but I wouldn't necessarily call it a friendship. But they do keep a relationship. Yeah, understand. But they do keep a relationship.
Did he ever provide any sentiments to the people that he was rented out to?
Not that I've seen. At that time, it was only, anything pre-Civil War is somebody else really talking about him in passing. After the Civil War, you start seeing him use his own words. Okay, well, I kept you here probably longer than you were expecting.
Thank you, Zach.
Thank you.